Hello, everyone. I'm John, and welcome back to ASMR True Crime Story, where I share true stories in a calm, relaxing whisper. Before we begin, press a number in the comments for me. Press 1 if you're already part of our ASMR family. Press 0 if this is your first time here. And press 2 if you want another whispered true story in the next upload. If you're enjoying the calm, please like, subscribe, and tap the notification bell so you don't miss tomorrow's case. Now, get comfortable, settle in, and slow your breathing. Let's begin. Mitrice Richardson came into the world on April 30th, 1985, in Los Angeles, California, a city of wide boulevards, palm trees, and contrasts. Her parents, Lattice Sutton and Michael Richardson, had met as juniors in high school. It was young love, the kind that starts with shy smiles in crowded hallways and late-night phone calls filled with plans for the future. But life moved quickly for them. Lattice became pregnant while entering her senior year, and even at such a young age, she was determined to keep her grades up and build a successful life. Stability mattered to her, not just for herself, but now for the child she was carrying. Lattice's determination was matched by the steady presence of her grandmother, Mildred. Mildred was more than a great-grandmother to Mitrice. She was a second mother. When Mitrice was born, it was Mildred who often watched over her so that Lattice and Michael could finish school. And later, when they both began working, Mildred's home was a safe, constant place where little Mitrice could grow. Her early years were full of warmth, birthday parties with homemade cakes, family gatherings where everyone seemed to know her name, and afternoons spent under Mildred's gentle watch. But behind the scenes, life for her young parents was complicated. Michael worked at a fast food restaurant, bringing in honest but modest pay. It wasn't enough to keep ahead of bills, and in a decision he would later regret, he began selling drugs on the side. It was easy money, far more than he could earn flipping burgers, but it was a dangerous path. When Mitrice was just 4 years old, Michael was caught and sentenced to 8 years in state prison. The separation was a hard break in her young life. Lattice, still so young herself, decided not to wait for him. She had a child to raise and a future to build. Eventually, she met a man named Larry Sutton, and the two married. Larry became Mitrice's stepfather, and together the family built a life in Los Angeles. But the early 1990s in LA were turbulent. In 1992, the city was shaken by the riots following the Rodney King verdict. Violence flared in neighborhoods, racial tensions ran high, and the streets didn't feel safe. Lattice and Larry made a decision. They would leave the city and move to Covina, a quieter suburb east of Los Angeles. It wasn't far in miles, but in atmosphere, it was a different world. Tree-lined streets, families out walking dogs, and the hum of distant traffic instead of sirens. In Covina, Mitrice thrived. Even as a child, she stood out, bright, ambitious, and curious. Her mother often reminded her, "You can do anything you want in this life, as long as you give 100%, and Mitrice believed her. In school, she was the kind of student teachers remembered for all the right reasons. She earned top grades, grasping lessons quickly, and with a sharpness that sometimes left her a little bored. In middle school, she joined the cheerleading team, not just for the routines, but for the joy of being active, part of a group, and in front of a crowd. That love of movement and performance would follow her into high school, where she competed in cheerleading competitions, danced, and sang. Her happiness was the kind that was contagious, drawing people in. Yet as she moved through her teenage years, something in her interest began to shift. The girl who once played outdoor sports and helped in the garden with her great-grandmother began avoiding activities that might get her dirty. She preferred to stay indoors, doing crossword puzzles, watching TV, dancing in her room, or writing in her journal. And when she got her driver's license, as most teens do, She decided walking anywhere was now officially over. Still, she never lost her love for learning. In high school, one subject captured her more than any other: psychology. The way the human mind worked fascinated her. Why people made certain choices, why they behaved in certain ways. She wanted to understand it all. When graduation came, she was ready to take that curiosity further. She enrolled at California State University, Fullerton, a campus about 20 miles from Covina. Rather than commute, her mother suggested she move in with Mildred again. The idea suited both women. Mildred enjoyed the company, and Mitrice could focus on her studies without the distraction of long drives. College life was a new chapter, and she embraced it. She was the first in her family to attend college, and like in high school, she excelled quickly. Her name appeared on the dean's list, her professors admired her drive, and she took a job at a shipping company in Santa Fe Springs to support herself. By 2008, she graduated with a bachelor's degree in psychology and had her sights set on a master's. The future looked bright. At 23, she was standing on the edge of everything she had worked for, ready to step forward. But the path ahead would take her somewhere no one expected, a turn that began quietly and would end in mystery. Mitrice's move into adulthood didn't feel rushed or chaotic. It unfolded like the chapters of a well-paced novel, steady, confident, with moments of joy woven into hard work. Living with Mildred again brought her a comfort that felt almost like coming home after a long journey. Mildred's small house had the same gentle hum it had when Mitrice was a child. The faint smell of coffee in the morning, the low sound of a television somewhere in the background, and the steady warmth of someone who cared for her deeply. For a young woman balancing school and work, that sense of security was invaluable. Mitrice would often come home from long days on campus and settle into conversation with her great-grandmother, sharing the day's events, talking about her classes, and sometimes dreaming out loud about the career she wanted to build. Her focus was on psychology, and she spoke about it with the kind of fascination that made others listen. She didn't just want a job, she wanted to make a difference. She imagined herself helping people untangle the knots in their lives, perhaps working in counseling, maybe even opening her own practice one day. That was the picture she carried in her mind, a future built on understanding and compassion. At Cal State Fullerton, Mitrice's drive didn't go unnoticed. She was the kind of student who sat in the front row, asked thoughtful questions, and stayed after class to clarify a point or share an insight. Professors often praised her essays for their clarity and depth. She wasn't just earning a degree, she was building a reputation as someone serious about her field. Her life wasn't all academics, though. She knew how to enjoy herself, and she was curious about the world beyond textbooks. In between classes and work, she spent time with friends, attended events, and explored the vibrant culture of Southern California. She wasn't afraid to try new things, and that curiosity often led her to unexpected opportunities. One of those opportunities came after graduation in 2008. While looking at options for graduate school, she also took on part-time work that was very different from her studies. She began dancing at a nightclub in Long Beach, a gay and lesbian venue known for its energy, music, and eclectic crowd. There, she adopted a stage name and crafted a playful, confident persona that allowed her to perform without blurring the line between her personal and professional life. To her, it was simply entertainment, dancing, engaging with people, and earning extra income. She even had business cards printed, complete with her photo, stage name, and contact details. She kept her performances lighthearted, far from the edge of anything dangerous. But not everyone saw it the same way. Her father, Michael, didn't approve. He worried that the nightclub environment could lead to trouble, that she might attract the wrong kind of attention or get caught up in situations she couldn't control. He expressed his concern plainly, reminding her of the risks. Maitrice tried to explain that it wasn't what he imagined. She wasn't stripping. She wasn't doing anything illegal. But fathers don't always see nuance when it comes to their daughter's safety. Around the same time, she began to explore modeling. She attended casting calls and interviews, some of them in less than professional settings. Friends grew concerned, urging her to be careful, to meet in public places, to bring someone with her. The modeling world can be unpredictable, and they didn't want her to be taken advantage of. It was also during this period that a woman named Vanessa entered her life. Accounts differ on the nature of their relationship. Some say they dated. Others believe Maitrice was interested in Vanessa, but Vanessa didn't feel the same way. What's clear is that there was tension, perhaps a love triangle, perhaps unreciprocated feelings, and it weighed on Maitrice. Friends noticed a shift. The outgoing young woman, who had once been quick to call, text, and make plans, was pulling back. When she did reach out, her messages were sometimes unusual, the sentences disjointed, the meaning unclear. On her social media, she posted cryptic thoughts at odd hours, the kind of statements that left people wondering what she was going through. One post read, "Have you ever woke up at 7 a.m. crying on a Saturday because now that you see the light, you see all the people lost in the dark?" It wasn't the kind of thing she used to share. Her friends felt uneasy, but it can be hard to know how to respond to something that feels deeply personal yet vague. Was she just being philosophical, or was she reaching out in her own way for help? As the summer of 2009 drew to a close, the changes became more pronounced. Her behavior grew harder to follow. She withdrew further from her social circles, and her communication became more fragmented. Even her mother began to sense that something was different, though the full picture was still hidden. The stage was quietly being set for a chain of events that would take her far from the world she had worked so hard to build. By the time Maitrice Richardson completed her studies at Cal State Fullerton in 2008, she had built the kind of resume that made her family proud. She wasn't just the first in her family to graduate from college. She had done it with distinction, making the dean's list and earning the respect of her professors. Her degree in psychology was more than a piece of paper. It was proof of her discipline, intelligence, and focus. Graduation, for many, is a crossroads. Some people step immediately into careers, others travel, and some drift for a while, unsure of their next step. Maitrice was not drifting, she was actively exploring. Her ultimate goal was a master's degree in psychology, but she wanted to work, save money, and perhaps gain life experience before committing to graduate school. She continued her job at the Santa Fe Springs Shipping Company, where she had already made herself known as a reliable, hardworking employee. She stood out in the workplace just as she had in school, polished, articulate, and capable of handling responsibilities without complaint. Coworkers often commented on her professionalism and her ability to get along with nearly anyone. But Maitrice was more than her work. She was ambitious in ways that weren't limited to her degree. She was drawn to creative and performance-oriented spaces, and her work at the Long Beach nightclub gave her a taste of a different kind of energy. There was music, movement, and the thrill of being in front of a crowd. She enjoyed slipping into her stage persona, performing for an audience that appreciated her confidence and charisma. The nightclub world was a far cry from the quiet academic discipline of psychology, but Maitrice had a way of balancing different sides of herself. At work, she was professional and serious. On stage, she was playful and bold. The modeling opportunities that came her way were another outlet for her creativity, though they came with their own set of concerns. She attended auditions and interviews, sometimes in settings that friends felt were questionable. They urged her to be cautious, to bring someone along, to make sure she wasn't putting herself at risk. Beatrice listened, but she was also fiercely independent. She trusted her own instincts and wasn't quick to back away from something that interested her. Through all of this, she kept her family close. She and her mother spoke often, and she remained in regular contact with her great-grandmother, Mildred, who had been such a constant presence in her life. Living in Mildred's home meant they saw each other daily, sharing meals, exchanging stories, and simply enjoying each other's company. Still, there were small signs that something in Beatrice's inner world was shifting. Friends who had once been in frequent contact with her noticed that she was reaching out less often. When she did send messages, they were sometimes oddly phrased or difficult to follow. They didn't always seem connected to the conversations at hand. Her social media posts began to take on a more reflective, sometimes cryptic tone. Some were deeply philosophical, others abstract. They weren't alarming in the way a clear cry for help might be, but for those who knew her well, they were different enough to stand out. By late summer of 2009, those subtle changes were becoming harder to ignore. The confident, outgoing Beatrice, who had balanced school, work, and performance so effortlessly, was beginning to seem distracted, less anchored. It wasn't yet clear what was happening, not to her friends, not to her family, and perhaps not even to herself. But those shifts would soon intersect with a series of events that would take her from the familiar safety of Mildred's home to a remote canyon in the Santa Monica Mountains, and to the last night anyone would see her alive. After graduation, Beatrice's life unfolded in layers. The grounded, focused woman pursuing her long-term career goals, and the adventurous, creative soul exploring worlds far removed from the academic hallways she had known for years. Her daytime life was orderly. At the Santa Fe Springs Shipping Company, she maintained the same strong work ethic that had earned her respect in the classroom. She was punctual, professional, and attentive to detail, the kind of employee managers relied on without second thought. But when the sun went down, her world sometimes shifted into something far more colorful. Long Beach was her stage for this second life. The nightclub where she worked was a lively gay and lesbian venue, known for its neon lights, thumping bass lines, and a crowd that came alive after dark. Here, she wasn't Mitress Richardson, aspiring psychologist. She was the performer in the center of the room, the woman in the eye-catching outfit, the one who could make the whole place feel electric with a smile and a few well-timed moves. She adopted a stage name, carefully separating this role from her personal identity. It gave her freedom, a way to perform with confidence, without opening herself completely to the vulnerability of strangers knowing her private life. She even had business cards printed, glossy with her photo, name, and contact information, a small but professional touch that showed she took this side of her life seriously. To her, this was harmless. It was entertainment, nothing more. She wasn't crossing lines she wasn't comfortable with, but to some in her family, particularly her father, Michael, the environment felt risky. He had lived through enough of the world to know how quickly a safe space could turn unsafe. He worried that the nightclub scene, no matter how welcoming, could lead to dangerous encounters. Beatrice listened, but she also held her ground. She tried to explain that it wasn't like he imagined. She wasn't stripping. She wasn't in back rooms with strangers. She was dancing, engaging with people, bringing energy to the crowd. But fathers rarely find reassurance in such explanations. In his mind, the safest way to avoid trouble was to stay out of situations where trouble could exist. Beyond dancing, Beatrice had set her sights on modeling. It was another extension of her love for presentation, aesthetics, and confidence. She began attending casting calls and interviews, though not all of them were in polished studios or professional offices. Some were in places that, to her friends, felt wrong. Private homes, poorly lit spaces or locations far from public view. They urged her to be cautious, to meet only in public venues, to never go alone. She valued their concern, but she also valued her independence. She was a young woman determined to navigate her own path, to see for herself where opportunities could lead. Around this time, Vanessa entered her life. Whether they were officially dating or whether it was a one-sided attraction has been debated by those who knew them, but there was undeniably a connection. Vanessa was charismatic, the kind of person who could hold attention without trying. Mitri seemed drawn to her. Some friends believed she was developing real feelings. Others thought it might have been more complicated, that Vanessa's attention was divided, that there was someone else in the picture. If there was a tension in the relationship, it began to show. Friends later recalled that Mitri's mood shifted during this period. The always connected friend who would call or text with updates suddenly became harder to reach. Her messages were sporadic and at times strangely worded. Sentences didn't always flow. Topics jumped without warning. It wasn't the kind of communication they were used to from her. Her social media presence began to reflect this change. She posted thoughts that were cryptic, sometimes philosophical, often without context. In the past, her posts had been lighthearted or straightforward. Now, they carried a tone that left people guessing at her meaning. One post in particular stood out. Have you ever woke up at 7 a.m. crying on a Saturday because now that you see the light, you see all the people lost in the dark? For those who knew her, this felt unusual, not necessarily alarming. Plenty of people posted emotional reflections online, but it wasn't like her. She had always been upbeat, the one who lifted others. This sounded more introspective, more weighted. Her friends didn't know whether to worry or to chalk it up to a passing mood. None of them could have guessed that these subtle shifts were part of a much larger and more troubling change. As the summer of 2009 began to wane, Mitri's life, once neatly balanced between work, school, family, and social life, seemed to be tilting. It wasn't a collapse. It wasn't loud. It was quieter than that, a gradual slide into something harder to define. It was in that space, between the woman she had been and the woman she was becoming, that the events of the coming weeks would unfold. Events that would lead her into the most dangerous night of her life. By late summer 2009, the changes in Mitrice Richardson were no longer faint ripples beneath the surface. They had become patterns that the people closest to her could see, even if they couldn't fully explain them. Friends who had known her for years began to feel a distance forming. She wasn't reaching out as much, and when she did, the messages she sent didn't always sound like her. The woman they remembered, articulate, warm, and quick to express herself, was now communicating in fragmented thoughts, with words that seemed stitched together loosely, sometimes without clear connection. Her mother, Latisse, had noticed too. Their conversations still happened, but there were moments when Mitrice's words carried an odd tone, as if she were speaking from a place that Latisse couldn't quite reach. In a family where communication had always been open, this shift felt unfamiliar. Online, the change was visible as well. Mitrice had been an active presence on her social media. Lighthearted updates, reflections on her day, jokes, photos from outings with friends. But now, her posts began to take on a different shape. They were cryptic, reflective, and sometimes dark. One post caught the attention of several friends. Have you ever woke up at 7 a.m. crying on a Saturday because now that you see the light, you see all the people lost in the dark? It wasn't just the content, it was the timing, the tone, and the imagery. The words painted a picture of someone seeing the world differently, maybe more sharply, maybe with a sense of heaviness. To some, this was simply introspection, the kind that comes after big life changes. After all, Mitrice had recently graduated, and the period after college can feel unsteady. But to those who knew her best, there was something about the consistency of these unusual posts and conversations that felt off. Her friendships were shifting too. She was less present, less engaged in the lives of those around her. The easy rhythm of text messages, phone calls, and in-person visits had slowed to a trickle. And when she did respond, sometimes her replies didn't quite address what had been said to her. Around this time, the tension with Vanessa seemed to be affecting her as well. Whether their relationship had ever been romantic or was simply a complicated friendship, it was clear that it mattered deeply to Mitrice. Friends recalled that she appeared more stressed and more irritable during this period, especially after interactions involving Vanessa. If she had been holding out hope for something more between them, that hope was fading. Vanessa eventually told her directly that she wasn't interested in a relationship. It was the kind of clear statement that could have closed a chapter, but instead, for Mitrice, it seemed to open something else. A space where her focus shifted inward, but not in a way that brought peace. Her friends saw the withdrawal deepen. Calls and texts became rare. Social media became her primary outlet, and even there, the messages were scattered, sometimes written in a way that made them difficult to interpret. To anyone on the outside, these changes might not have seemed urgent. They might have been brushed off as a young woman navigating the normal stresses of life, relationships, in the uncertain years after graduation. But to those who had known her for years, there was a growing sense that something beneath the surface was changing. Something they couldn't quite name, but something that would soon step into the open. It would take only a handful of days for that quiet unease to transform into alarm. The last days of summer 2009 drifted into the softer light of September. And for Mitrice Richardson, the changes her friends and family had been noticing began to sharpen into moments that were harder to dismiss. The sense of distance, the cryptic messages, the shifts in mood, all of it seemed to be coalescing into something more visible, something that could no longer hide in the background of her daily life. It began with small, scattered moments, the kind that only stand out when you look back and see the full chain of events. For her mother, Latisse, one of those moments came in the form of a text message. It was early in the day, and Mitrice had sent something unexpected. Words that didn't seem to connect to anything they'd been talking about. Words that felt almost like fragments of a conversation she was having somewhere else in her own mind. The message read, "I'm writing about because you told me I can be anything I wanted. You told me I was Miss America. You told me I was America's next top model. Now you know what I want to be when I grow up. Miss Mother Nature. Miss America's fake ass joke. So I'm trying to find my way to Michelle Obama to see if she will talk to Mr. Obama about creating my position within the White House." Latisse read it once, then again, searching for the thread that would make it make sense. This wasn't a playful note. It wasn't her daughter's usual style of humor or her typical burst of creativity. It was something else, words tumbling over each other without a clear path. There was an edge to it, but also a kind of detachment, as if the ideas were coming from somewhere far away. She tried to get clarity, but when she asked, Mitrice didn't give a straightforward answer. The conversation drifted instead, leaving Latisse with that uneasy feeling a parent gets when they know something is wrong but can't quite put their finger on it. September 16th began like any other Wednesday. Mitrice woke up, got ready for the day, and headed to her job at the Santa Fe Springs Shipping Company. According to a co-worker, she came in that morning in a good mood, smiling, talking, showing no obvious sign that anything was amiss. It seemed like a normal workday, but sometime around her lunch break, things shifted. Mitrice left the office and she didn't come back. There was no call to explain, no quick text saying she'd be gone for the rest of the day. She simply didn't return. That evening was supposed to be one of her regular nights in with her great-grandmother, Mildred. The two had a tradition of sharing Wednesday dinners, a quiet, comforting ritual that kept their bond close. But when Mitrice arrived home, she told Mildred she wouldn't be staying for dinner that night. "The ocean is calling my name," she said. It wasn't a phrase Mildred was used to hearing from her. Mitrice wasn't someone who spent a lot of time near the water, and this sudden pull toward the beach was unusual. Still, there was no obvious reason to be alarmed. She sounded calm, even lighthearted. She left the house around 5 p.m., her destination set for Malibu. The drive along the Pacific Coast Highway was one of California's most scenic routes, a ribbon of road winding between the mountains and the sea, the horizon stretching endlessly to the west. As she drove, the sky would have been shifting toward sunset, the ocean reflecting gold and orange beneath the cooling air. But before she reached Malibu's shoreline, she made an unexpected stop. Sometime between 4 p.m. and 7 p.m., she pulled into the driveway of a woman named Irene, a person she didn't appear to have any ongoing contact with. When Irene arrived home, she found her lawn and the steps to her front door scattered with business cards, Mitrice's business cards. They were just lying there, as if dropped or tossed without care. Puzzled, Irene picked them up and soon noticed something else. A note tucked under the windshield wiper of her husband's car. The handwriting was Mitrice's, but the content was baffling. There was a hand-drawn smiley face on the page alongside the words, "Black woman scorned." On the left side of the page, in a different section, the words, "I, Uncle Johnny Jimmy," were written. Another fragment without context. Irene didn't know what to make of it. She didn't know Mitrice personally, and the note gave her no explanation. What she did feel, though, was a twinge of unease, the kind that settles in your stomach and won't leave. Something about this wasn't right. From there, Mitrice continued on toward the coast. By the time she reached Malibu, the sun would have been dropping toward the horizon, painting the sky in the last brilliant colors of the day. It is believed that she stopped somewhere along the way to watch the sunset, taking in the view before getting back into her car to drive further north along the Pacific Coast Highway. That road at night becomes a different place. The glare of the sun disappears, and the vast openness of the ocean turns into a dark expanse. The air cools, and the small pull-offs and beach access points grow quiet. Most travelers stick to their destinations: restaurants, hotels, home. For Mitrice, that destination was Jeffrey's, an upscale restaurant overlooking the water. She had no reservation, but she walked in anyway, dressed in a casual Bob Marley t-shirt, layered over a long-sleeve shirt with jeans, a pink alligator print belt, Vans on her feet, and a Rastafarian hat. It wasn't formal wear, but she didn't seem to care. She was there for reasons of her own. What happened inside Jeffrey's, and in the hours that followed, would set the stage for the mystery that still hangs over her story today. The drive from Covina to Malibu was not a quick one. It could take over an hour, even more if the roads were heavy with traffic. But for someone like Mitrice, who had made up her mind to follow the sudden pull of the ocean, time on the road might have felt like part of the experience. When she left her great-grandmother Mildred's house that September evening, she wasn't in a rush. Her words, "The ocean is calling my name," still lingered in the air as she closed the door behind her. Mildred, used to her granddaughter's independence, didn't press her to stay. She had no way of knowing that this trip would be the last time she would see her alive. The first part of her route wound through familiar suburban streets, the kind lit by neat rows of street lamps. As the drive continued, the scenery began to change. Suburban order gave way to stretches of highway, the traffic carrying her westward. Eventually, she would merge onto the Pacific Coast Highway, a road that clings to the very edge of California's coastline. For many, this highway is a place for day trips, a way to soak in the beauty of the Pacific. On one side, the steep mountains of the Santa Monica Range rise abruptly from the road. On the other, the ocean spreads endlessly into the horizon. That evening, the view would have been drenched in the golden haze of a California sunset, waves catching the last light, cliffs deepening into shadow. It's believed that Mitri stopped somewhere along the way to take in the sunset. Perhaps she pulled over at one of the many turnouts that overlook the water. The Pacific Coast Highway is dotted with these small pockets where travelers can pause, step out of their cars, and watch the horizon swallow the sun. There are no official records of her stopping, but the timeline suggests she might have lingered before continuing north toward Malibu. The feeling of that time of day is hard to overstate. The tourists have thinned out, the daytime swimmers have packed up their towels and gone home. There's a quiet to the coast in those moments after sunset, when the light is fading but the sky still holds a trace of color. But before she reached the heart of Malibu, Mitrice made an odd detour, one that would later be a source of confusion and speculation. She stopped at the home of a woman named Irene, a person who, as far as records suggest, had no ongoing relationship with her. When Irene arrived home sometime between 4 p.m. and 7 p.m., she was immediately struck by the state of her property. Scattered across the lawn and the steps to her front door were business cards. Mitrice's business cards. Irene picked them up, puzzled. Why were they here? How had they been left like this? As she moved toward the driveway, she noticed something else. A note tucked under the windshield wiper of her husband's car. It was handwritten, unmistakably by Mitrice, but the words didn't form a coherent message. On one part of the page, there was a small hand-drawn smiley face. Alongside it were the words, "Black woman scorned." On another part, separated from the first, were the words, "I Uncle Johnny Jimmy." It was the kind of note that made no immediate sense, neither as a message nor as a casual gesture. Irene didn't know what to make of it, but she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that something was wrong. What Mitrice did in the moments after leaving Irene's property is not entirely clear. But by around 7 p.m., she was back on the Pacific Coast Highway, headed toward the small cluster of upscale restaurants and shops that make up part of Malibu's beachfront. Her destination, Jeffrey's, a high-end restaurant perched above the water. Known for its panoramic views and refined menu, it was the sort of place where a glass of wine could cost as much as a casual dinner elsewhere, and where diners came to celebrate anniversaries or mark special occasions. It was not, in other words, the kind of place Mitrice was known to frequent, nor the kind of place one simply wandered into without a plan. And yet, that's exactly what she did. The parking at Jeffrey's is valet only, and as she pulled into the lot, a valet approached her car. He explained that he needed to park another guest vehicle first, and asked her to wait until he returned to move hers. Mitrice agreed, but as soon as he walked away, something strange happened. Instead of waiting, she got out of her car and climbed into another vehicle, the valet's personal car. When the valet returned, he saw her sitting there, going through the CDs that were inside. "What are you doing?" he asked, no doubt startled. "It's subliminal," she answered, as if that explained everything. The valet didn't understand. Her tone wasn't hostile, but her words didn't fit the situation. She then told him she needed to avenge the death of Michael Jackson, a comment that landed as oddly as her first. She went on to ask if someone named Vanessa was there, warning him to watch out for a man with tattooed arms. The valet, sensing something was off, decided to keep an eye on her. He watched as she walked toward the restaurant entrance, and he quietly told the hostess to do the same. Inside Jeffrey's, she asked for a table for one and was seated in the main dining area. Around her, guests chatted over candlelit tables, glasses of wine catching the light. The hum of conversation mixed with the sound of the ocean just beyond the windows. Mitri stood out not only because of her casual clothes, but because she seemed untethered to the rhythm of the place. She ordered a cocktail and a Kobe steak, a meal that alone would cost over $60. While she waited for her food, she approached a nearby table where 7 guests were seated together, introducing herself and making unusual comments. She told them she was from another planet, that her mother was from Earth. When her meal arrived, she returned to her own table to eat, but once she finished, she drifted back to the group she'd spoken with earlier. As they got up to leave, she followed them toward the exit, telling them she was going to Hawaii and that they should contact her when she arrived. It was at that point that the restaurant manager stopped her. Her bill, about $90, was still unpaid. She told him the group had covered it, but he knew they hadn't. "I'm busted," she said finally. "What are we going to do?" The answer in that moment was to call the police. And with that call, the night took its first irreversible turn. The low hum of conversation filled Jeffrey's dining room that evening. The quiet clink of silverware on porcelain, the muffled laughter of friends sharing wine, the sound of the Pacific just beyond the open windows. For most of the diners, it was just another night in Malibu. But for Mitrice Richardson, it was the setting for a series of moments that would soon pull her into the orbit of law enforcement. She had already made herself noticeable before she even sat down. The valet had seen her slip into his personal car, rummaging through CDs, speaking in riddles about subliminal messages and avenging Michael Jackson's death. She had asked him about someone named Vanessa, then cautioned him to be careful around a man with tattooed arms. Her words had been unusual enough that the valet discreetly warned the hostess to keep an eye on her. Inside, Mitrice carried herself without hesitation. She requested a table for one, was seated in the main dining area, and ordered a cocktail and a Kobe steak, one of the most expensive items on the menu. She didn't fidget or seem rushed. Instead, she appeared to take in her surroundings with a calmness that almost masked the strangeness of her earlier behavior. As she waited for her food, her attention shifted to a nearby table occupied by 7 guests. She approached them, inserting herself into their conversation as though she were already part of their party. Her comments were curious, almost whimsical, but not in a way that fit the moment. She told them she was from another planet, that her mother was from Earth. The words were delivered without irony, without laughter, as if she believed them completely. When her steak arrived, she returned to her own table. The plate was set before her, a rich, perfectly seared cut of beef, the kind of meal that, in a place like Jeffrey's, was meant to be savored. She ate, and when she was done, she returned to the group she had been speaking with earlier. They were finishing their own meals, settling their bill, and preparing to leave. As they got up, Mitrice followed, telling them she was going to Hawaii and that they should contact her when she arrived. That was when the manager stepped in. He stopped her at the door and asked about her bill. It was still unpaid, roughly $90 for her drink and steak. "They paid for it," she said, motioning toward the group she had been talking to. The manager shook his head. "No, they didn't." Her expression shifted, a flicker of something unreadable passing over her face. Then she said, almost casually, "I'm busted. What are we going to do?" There were options: a credit card, cash, but she had neither. When the manager asked how she intended to pay, she emptied her pockets to show she had nothing, no wallet, no means of payment. In that moment, the situation crossed a line. Her inability to pay, combined with her odd behavior, made the staff uneasy. The manager instructed the hostess to call the police. While they waited, the hostess allowed Mitrice to use the phone. The only number she seemed able to recall was her great-grandmother Mildred's. When she reached her, she explained the situation. Mildred offered to pay over the phone, to give her credit card information right then and there. But the restaurant's policy wouldn't allow it. They needed her to be present, to sign the receipt in person. It was just after 9 p.m. when the call to law enforcement went through. The hostess described the customer as possibly being on drugs or experiencing some kind of mental health episode. 3 deputies were dispatched to the scene. When they arrived, they spoke with Mitrice, asking questions to assess her state of mind. She told them her wallet was in her car and that she could pay if she could get to it. The deputies went to her vehicle to retrieve it, but when they opened the door, they found a chaotic mess. Papers, personal items, bits of trash scattered throughout. There was no wallet in sight. They did find her driver's license. And in the car, they also located a small amount of marijuana. Not enough to warrant a serious charge, but enough to be noted. The deputies administered a sobriety test. She passed. She wasn't intoxicated, at least not in the sense the test could measure. With no way to pay and the restaurant manager wanting to press charges, the deputies made their decision. At 24 years old, Mitrice Richardson was placed in handcuffs, escorted to the patrol car, and driven to the Lost Hills Sheriff's Station. The arrest report would later list her charges as possession of marijuana and defrauding an innkeeper, the latter being the legal term for leaving without paying a bill. From the outside, it might have seemed like a routine incident, a young woman unable to pay her restaurant tab, taken in for a minor drug possession. But for those who saw her that night, there was nothing routine about her behavior, and yet, in the official paperwork, none of that strangeness was recorded. No mention of her unusual statements, her odd actions, or the concern voiced by the restaurant staff. It was a decision, whether by oversight or intent, that would shape the hours ahead. Because the next time she stepped into the night, she would not be walking back into a place of safety. The call to the Lost Hills Sheriff's Station from Jeffrey's restaurant was made just after the evening crowd had begun to thin. The hostess, her voice calm but firm, told the dispatcher there was a woman at the restaurant who couldn't pay her bill. She explained that the customer was acting oddly, not aggressive, but in ways that made little sense. She might be under the influence of something, or she might be having some kind of mental health issue. 3 deputies were sent out to the scene. When they walked into Jeffrey's, the dining room had quieted from its earlier bustle. The scent of grilled seafood and seared steaks still hung in the air, but the room was mostly cleared of diners. At one table sat Mitrice Richardson, 24 years old, petite, and composed in posture, but with an air about her that suggested she was not entirely present in the moment. The deputies spoke with her. They asked about the unpaid bill, about whether she had a way to settle it. She told them her wallet was in her car, that if she could get to it, she could pay right away. It was a reasonable sounding solution, and so they walked with her to the parking lot. The night air was cool, carrying with it the salt of the ocean. Under the yellow glow of the lot's lamps, they opened her car. Inside, it wasn't neat and orderly. Papers were scattered across the seats and floorboards, along with other personal items, the kind of clutter that made searching for anything specific a challenge. The deputies dug through the mess, looking for the wallet she'd said was there. They didn't find it. What they did find was her driver's license and a small quantity of marijuana. It wasn't enough to be treated as a serious criminal offense. In many cases, it could have been handled with a citation, but it was noted the deputies administered a sobriety test right there in the lot. To their eyes, her earlier strange remarks might have hinted at intoxication. But the test told another story. She passed. Whatever was causing her behavior, it wasn't alcohol. Back inside the restaurant, the manager was asked again whether he wanted to press charges for the unpaid bill. He did. His decision meant that there was no longer a question of whether she could simply be let go with a warning. Mitress was placed under arrest. The metal of the handcuffs clicked shut around her wrists, the sound small but final. She was escorted to the patrol car, placed in the back seat, and driven away from the glow of the restaurant lights toward the darker, quieter road that led inland. The Lost Hills Sheriff's Station was not far, less than 10 miles away, but the drive at night felt longer. The road wound through stretches of canyon and hillside, the ocean disappearing from view as the land rose around them. When they arrived, she was escorted inside. The booking process began. Her information recorded, her personal property cataloged. Officially, she was charged with possession of marijuana and defrauding an innkeeper. But something important was missing. Despite the reports from the restaurant, despite the deputies having witnessed her unusual statements and actions, none of it was documented in a way that might have flagged her as someone in need of a mental health evaluation. In the official paperwork, there was no note of erratic behavior, no suggestion that she might require closer observation, no indication that she might be at risk if released without support. In California, if someone is deemed to be a danger to themselves or others due to mental illness, they can be placed under a 72-hour psychiatric hold for evaluation. But for that to happen, there has to be a written record of behavior that supports such a decision. Without it, the system doesn't move in that direction. That night, the deputies noted nothing that would trigger such a hold. Still, before her time in custody was over, she was allowed to make phone calls, 4 in total. Exactly who she called is unclear to this day. The only number she seemed to remember earlier in the evening had been her great-grandmother Mildred's. Whether she reached her again from the station is uncertain. The phone she was given to use that night was not the payphone typically available to inmates. That phone was out of order. Instead, she used a regular desk phone. Calls from it were not recorded. Deputies later said they saw her talking on the phone, but they couldn't or wouldn't recall who she was speaking to or what was said. There is even the possibility that she had no one on the line at all, that she was speaking to the receiver without anyone on the other end. At home, Latisse had been told earlier by the station that her daughter would not be released until morning. That information was the reason she stayed in for the night instead of making the drive to pick Mitress up immediately. She didn't want to leave her 10-year-old daughter alone in the middle of the night for what she thought would be a wasted trip. What Latisse didn't know was that in the early hours of the next morning, those plans and those assurances would be undone. The Lost Hills Sheriff's Station was quiet when the patrol car pulled in that night. Outside, the surrounding hills were cloaked in darkness, the roads nearly empty except for the rare pair of headlights sweeping past. Inside, the station's fluorescent lights cast a pale, almost sterile glow, the kind of light that flattens shadows and makes the air feel heavier. When the deputies opened the back door of the patrol car, Mitress stepped out. She was still calm in demeanor, not visibly agitated, but the strangeness that had followed her all evening lingered in the way she moved, the way she held her gaze. They guided her through the booking process. Her name, birth date, and address were recorded. Her fingerprints were taken. The property she had on her, the few personal items she'd carried, were collected and stored. Her clothes were noted, the casual Bob Marley t-shirt layered over long sleeves, jeans cinched with a pink alligator print belt, Vans shoes, and a Rastafarian hat. All of it would be listed and kept until her release. Her charges were simple on paper: possession of marijuana and defrauding an innkeeper. the latter referring to the unpaid bill at Jeffrey's. There was nothing in the official arrest record to suggest that her mental state had been unusual, despite the repeated observations from restaurant staff and the valet earlier in the night. The deputies wrote nothing that would flag her as potentially unstable, nothing that might have prompted a psychiatric evaluation or a temporary hold for her own safety. That omission was critical. Without it, the law would not require or even suggest that she be kept in custody until someone could pick her up. She was placed in a cell. The concrete walls were bare, the air cool. There was no window to the outside, no way to mark the passing of time except by the sounds in the building. While she was there, she was allowed to make phone calls, 4 in total. The details of those calls remain frustratingly unclear. Normally, inmates would use the payphone inside the jail area, and those calls would be recorded. But that night, the payphone was out of order. Instead, deputies let her use the desk phone, a regular line. Calls made on it were not recorded, and no official record was kept of the numbers dialed. Deputies later recalled seeing her on the phone, speaking into the receiver, but none could say for sure who she called, or even if anyone was on the line. The only number she had seemed able to recall earlier in the evening was her great-grandmother Mildred's, so it's possible she reached her again. It's also possible she spoke with someone else, or with no one at all. Meanwhile, at home, Latisse had gone to bed with the understanding that her daughter would remain at the station overnight. When she had called earlier, deputies had told her Mitrice would be held until morning. That had been the deciding factor in Latisse's choice to stay home rather than drive to the station that night. She had a 10-year-old daughter asleep in the house, and she didn't want to leave her alone in the middle of the night for what she believed would be an unnecessary trip. It was a decision made with trust in the information she'd been given by law enforcement, trust that her daughter would be in a secure place until the sun came up. But as the hours moved toward midnight, decisions were being made at the station that would unravel that sense of security entirely. Without a phone, without her wallet, without her car, without even a jacket against the cool night air, Mitrice Richardson's time in custody was about to end. It was just past midnight when the decision was made to release her. The station clock marked the time, 12:15 a.m., September 17th, 2009. Outside, the quiet of the Santa Monica Mountains pressed in on the building. The kind of quiet that feels deeper than silence, where even the air seems still, and the darkness seems to swallow the edges of the world. Inside, the routine of processing a release was mechanical. The deputies went to retrieve her personal items, but there was little to hand back. Her phone, her wallet, her car keys, all of it was still in her car, impounded 15 miles away. She had nothing to her name in that moment except the clothes on her back. No identification, no cash, no credit card. Her car, the only means she had to travel, was locked up in a yard that wouldn't open again until morning. The distance to get there, even in daylight, would have been a long walk. In the dark, along narrow roads with no sidewalks or street lamps, it was not just impractical, it was dangerous. But on paper, she was not considered a threat to herself or anyone else. She had no criminal record, her charges were minor, and, according to the deputies' own reports, she showed no signs of mental illness or intoxication. Without any documentation to the contrary, the department's policy leaned toward release. The deputies did offer her options. She could remain in her cell until morning. She could sit in the lobby for the rest of the night, but Mitrice declined. Whether it was out of confidence, pride, or simply the desire to leave, she made it clear she didn't want to stay. By law, they couldn't force her, and so they let her go. The station door closed behind her, and she stepped into the cool night. From the front steps of the Lost Hills Sheriff's Station, There was no easy route to anywhere. The surrounding roads were bordered by stretches of dark hillside and canyon. The hum of the Pacific Coast Highway was far in the distance, beyond winding turns and miles of shadowed terrain. There was no one waiting outside for her, no taxi idled at the curb, no friend pulled up to take her home. The world beyond the station's front door was as empty as it was silent. Her car was 15 miles away. The nearest open business, a gas station, was several miles off. The station itself sat in a pocket of land where the rural edge of Malibu met the inland canyons. Beautiful by day, but lonely and unforgiving by night. Somewhere inside, her booking record was being filed away. Another case moved on through the system. But for Mitrice, the night was just beginning. She walked away from the station, swallowed by darkness in every direction. It would be the last time anyone saw her alive in a place of certainty. In the hours after her release from the Lost Hills Sheriff's Station, the night deepened into its coldest, quietest stretch. The roads in that part of the Santa Monica Mountains are narrow and winding, flanked by steep slopes and heavy brush. There are no sidewalks, no steady line of streetlights, only occasional driveways and the faint glow of a porch light from a home set far back from the road. It was still before dawn when the phone rang at the sheriff's station. The time was recorded as 6:38 a.m. on September 17th, 2009. The caller was a man named Bill Smith, a retired reporter who lived in a secluded part of the Malibu Hills known as Monte Nido. His voice was calm, but his words were unusual. He told the dispatcher there was a young woman in his backyard, a slim black woman with afro-textured hair. When he stepped outside and asked if she was all right, she told him she was just resting. She wasn't aggressive, didn't seem frightened, but she also wasn't acting like someone who knew exactly where she was or where she was going. The encounter was brief. Bill went back inside, perhaps thinking she might leave on her own. But when he looked out again, she was gone. Monte Nido is not a place you simply stumble upon. It is rugged, remote, and surrounded by steep canyon walls. The trails and dirt paths that wind through it are difficult even for seasoned hikers, and in the dim light of early morning, they are treacherous. To reach the area from the sheriff's station on foot would have meant several miles of walking along dangerous roads, with long stretches of absolute darkness in the hours before the sun began to rise. Deputies were sent to check on the call. They drove out toward Bill's home, looking for any sign of the woman he had described. But by the time they arrived, she was nowhere to be found. They searched the immediate area but saw no footprints, no movement in the brush, no sign that anyone had recently passed through. Back at home, Latisse was waking to a reality she did not expect. She had gone to sleep the night before, trusting that her daughter would still be in custody in the morning, ready to be picked up. But when she called the station around 5:20 a.m. to ask about the process for posting bail, she was told Mitrice had already been released hours earlier. The shock in that moment was immediate. The night before, she had been told her daughter would not be released until daylight. That assurance had kept her from making the drive in the dark. Now, the deputies on the phone were explaining that her daughter had been let go at 12:15 a.m. because she had no prior record and her charges didn't justify holding her. They told Latisse that Mitrice had declined offers to remain in the lobby or her cell. She was, in their words, an adult, free to leave if she wished. But free to go where? She had no phone, no wallet, no car, no means of calling a cab or paying for a ride. And now Latisse knew she had been walking in the dark alone, in a part of Los Angeles County that was dangerous to navigate even in daylight. Panic began to set in. Latisse started calling friends and family, asking if anyone had heard from Mitrice. No one had. Her calls became more urgent. The feeling in her chest tightened with each no. Within minutes, She was back on the phone with the sheriff's station. She told them she wanted to file a missing persons report. The deputies hesitated. They explained that unless there were serious circumstances, they usually waited 24 hours before treating someone as missing. They urged her to wait, to give it time, saying her daughter might still turn up. Latisse was not convinced. She knew her daughter, and nothing about this was normal, but she was being told to wait. While she was on the phone, the station received a report from Bill Smith in Monte Nido. The description he gave matched Mitrice. The deputies told Latisse about it, even gave her directions to the area where Bill lived. It was the first tangible lead, the first indication of where her daughter might have gone after leaving the station. Determined to act, Latisse filed the missing persons report and then headed toward Monte Nido herself. She carried with her a growing certainty, an unshakable feeling in her gut that something was terribly wrong. The place she was driving to was not easy to reach. The terrain was steep, the roads winding and narrow. Even by daylight, the canyons of Monte Nido had a way of swallowing sound, of making you feel far removed from the rest of the world. And somewhere in that rugged landscape, her daughter had been seen just hours earlier, alone, on foot, and already fading into the shadows of the hills. The morning sun was already high when Latisse reached the Monte Nido area on September 17, 2009. The drive from her home had been filled with a taut, unshakable tension. That tightness in the chest that only comes when a parent knows deep in their bones that their child is in trouble. Every mile of winding canyon road brought her closer to the place where her daughter had last been seen. But it also made her more aware of how isolated it was out here. Monte Nido was not a place you simply passed through. It was hidden away in the folds of the Santa Monica Mountains, an area of rugged ridgelines, deep gullies, and thick brush. Homes here were spaced far apart, often tucked behind long driveways or partially concealed by trees. There were no bustling sidewalks, no corner stores, no casual foot traffic. Anyone walking alone here would stand out immediately. And that's exactly what had happened when Bill Smith saw a young woman resting in his backyard earlier that morning. Latisse carried that image with her as she arrived. She had been told by deputies that Bill's property was where her daughter had been spotted, and now she wanted to see it with her own eyes. She wanted to know where Mitrice had been, to understand the terrain, to feel the space where she'd stood just hours before. When she got there, the feeling in her stomach sank even lower. The area wasn't just remote, it was difficult. Narrow roads bent sharply without warning. On one side, there might be a drop-off into a steep ravine. On the other, a dense wall of chaparral. In many places, there was barely enough room for 2 cars to pass. The land here seemed to fold in on itself, the canyons wrapping around like a labyrinth of rock and vegetation. And it wasn't just the remoteness that troubled her. She knew her daughter. Mitrice had never been a hiker. She disliked bugs, avoided getting dirty, and had a genuine fear of the dark. She wasn't the kind of person who would choose to wander through the unlit, unfamiliar wilderness in the middle of the night. The idea that she would have made her way here on foot, without transportation, seemed so far removed from her nature that it made Latisse's concerns swell into something closer to dread. Still, the first official search would not begin immediately. By the family's account, it was not until 48 hours after her disappearance that a coordinated effort was launched. The sheriff's department, however, would later say it was just 8 hours after she was reported missing. The discrepancy would become one of many points of contention between the family and law enforcement. When the search began, deputies brought in a scent tracking dog. The animal was given an item of Mitrice's clothing, something carrying her distinct scent, and was led to Bill Smith's property, the last confirmed location. The dog's nose worked methodically, weaving through the yard, across patches of dirt and grass, and toward the edge of the property. The air was cool enough to hold scent well, and for a moment it seemed as though the animal had found something. The trail led from Bill's yard to a nearby neighbor's property, drawing a line of possibility through the morning air. But then, abruptly, the scent was lost. There was no clear continuation, no obvious path forward. It was as if the trail had simply vanished, swallowed by the terrain, or interrupted by something the dog could not trace. The search continued for 8 hours that day. Deputies and volunteers combed the immediate area, moving through yards, driveways, and the edges of wild land. They looked for any sign, a footprint in the dirt, a scrap of clothing, something dropped or discarded, but nothing turned up. By the time the sun dipped low over the ridgelines, the official search was called off. The canyons returned to their quiet, the kind of quiet that is not comforting but watchful. Somewhere in that stillness, Latisse believed her daughter was out there. Whether lost, hurt, or in danger, she didn't know. But she knew Mitrice would not simply choose to vanish. For the family, the lack of answers so soon after the disappearance was crushing. Each hour that passed without a lead felt like sand slipping through an hourglass. Time they could never get back. And in a place as vast and unforgiving as the Santa Monica Mountains, time was everything. The trail had gone cold almost as soon as it began. Days passed, then weeks. And with each sunrise, the reality settled deeper into the family's bones. Mitrice was gone, and no one knew where she was or what had happened after she was seen in Monte Nido. The initial search had ended without answers, but Latisse and the people who loved her daughter did not stop looking. They made trips back into the canyons, handing out flyers, knocking on doors, speaking to anyone who might have seen something. They retraced the roads leading away from the Lost Hills Sheriff's Station, imagining the paths she might have taken on foot in the darkness. They walked the narrow shoulders of Malibu Canyon Road, knowing it was dangerous, but feeling the need to understand what she would have faced that night. As the days stretched into October, official control of the investigation shifted. The case was transferred from the LAPD Missing Persons Unit to the Robbery Homicide Division. The move signaled a change in tone, the implication being that this was no longer treated as a simple missing adult who might return. This was something more serious. One of the first steps taken by the division was to examine Mitrice's car. It had been towed from Jeffrey's parking lot on the night of her arrest and had been sitting in impound ever since. When detectives opened it, they found the wallet she told deputies was inside that night. Inside the wallet was her debit card, and when they checked her account, they found she had more than $2,000 in the bank. She could have easily paid the $89 bill at Jeffrey's if she'd been allowed to retrieve her wallet from her vehicle. Her phone was also in the car, along with other personal items, including her journal. Investigators read through its pages, looking for any clue as to her mindset in the days leading up to her disappearance. The entries reflected fragments of her thoughts, some of them coherent, others more abstract. A psychologist working with LAPD suggested that Mitrice might have been experiencing symptoms of a mental illness, possibly bipolar disorder, but there was no definitive diagnosis. The family's frustration with the sheriff's department grew sharper. To them, the logic was undeniable. Had the deputies allowed her to access her wallet from her car, she could have paid for her meal, and none of this might have happened. More than that, they argued, the deputies had ample reason to suspect something was wrong. Her behavior at Jeffrey's had been unusual enough for staff to call police. She had been found in the valet's car, made strange comments about Michael Jackson and being from another planet, and inserted herself into strangers' conversations. Yet none of this was written in the arrest paperwork. To the family, it felt like the department was protecting itself, avoiding the admission that they had made a mistake by releasing her alone in the middle of the night with no means to get home. As the months wore on, there were flickers of possible sightings. In January 2010, 4 months after she vanished, authorities and volunteers mounted a large search effort in the canyons. With around 250 people involved, they scoured the area where she had last been seen, searching for any sign of her, a piece of clothing, jewelry, even a scrap of paper, but they found nothing. Not long after, her father, Michael Richardson, was driving to Las Vegas when he claimed to have seen her. He said she was working as a prostitute, possibly recruited by someone she had met through her job at the nightclub or at the Playboy Mansion. According to him, when he called her name, she ran into a crowd and disappeared. In March 2010, 6 months after the disappearance, the family was called into the sheriff's station to view something they had been told didn't exist. The station's surveillance footage from the night Mitrice had been in custody. For months, they had been told there were no cameras that recorded footage, only monitors for observation. Then suddenly, the footage was found. On the grainy black and white video, Mitrice could be seen holding onto the cell bars, swaying from side to side. To her family, she looked agitated, not her usual self. The sheriff's department disagreed, insisting she had appeared fine and that her behavior was normal. The timestamp showed her being released at 12:20 a.m. The jailer walked her to the door. As he returned inside, another deputy was seen exiting the building. This detail disturbed the family because they had been told no deputies were present at the time of her release. It raised questions. Did the deputy see her leave? Did he speak to her? Was there more to that moment than anyone had admitted? In June 2010, a former friend believed he saw her in a Las Vegas casino. He called out her name. She appeared startled, nervous, and then she ran. Over 70 people in Las Vegas would claim to have seen her in the months following her disappearance. Investigators followed up, speaking to witnesses, searching the areas where she was reportedly spotted. None of these leads resulted in finding her. By August 2010, it had been nearly a year since she walked out of the Lost Hills Sheriff's Station. For her family, every day without answers had been a day of dread, hope, and exhaustion mixed into one. And then, in the heat of that August, a discovery in the mountains would end the search for her body, but not for the truth. The heat of August 2010 hung heavy over the Santa Monica Mountains, the kind of still, dry heat that makes the air shimmer above the earth. On August 9th, 2 park rangers were moving through a remote area known as Dark Canyon, a place so steep, so tangled with vegetation, that it was rarely touched by casual hikers. Dark Canyon lived up to its name. The walls of rock and dense brush shut out much of the light, even in the middle of the day. The ground underfoot was uneven, littered with loose stones, dried leaves, and twisted roots. To get there required effort, deliberate, sustained effort, and a willingness to navigate terrain that could turn treacherous with a single misplaced step. The rangers were there on routine duty, but what they found would change everything. They were making their descent into the canyon when one of them stopped. Ahead, partially concealed by the undergrowth, lay a sight that made the air feel suddenly colder. It was a human skull. The hair was still attached in places, dark strands matted against the bone. Close by, bits of clothing lay scattered, women's jeans, a brown belt. Other items were nowhere to be seen. There were no shoes, no underwear, no shirt, no jacket, no socks. As they looked around, they saw more. A femur, other bones. The right leg lay about 6 feet from the rest of the remains, and strangely, the bones appeared undisturbed by animals. In an area known for coyotes and scavenger birds, this was unusual. After nearly a year exposed to the elements, most remains in such a place would bear clear signs of wildlife activity. Here, there was almost none. The location itself was deeply puzzling. It was miles from the Lost Hills Sheriff's Station, miles from the last confirmed sighting of Mitrice in Monte Nido. The difficulty of reaching it was such that even the coroner's team could not get vehicles close enough. They would have to remove the remains by helicopter. Before that could happen, photographs were taken, not by official crime scene photographers, but by one of the rangers on his personal cell phone. This was not the standard for such a discovery. Normally, a find like this would be documented extensively before anything was moved. And then there was the condition of what they found. Mitrice's left arm was flexed tightly in an unnatural position, almost defying gravity, as though it had been placed that way. This was not something environmental factors could easily explain. When the remains were officially recovered, 5 of her neck bones were missing. Without them, determining if she had been strangled or suffered certain types of neck trauma was impossible. The coroner's initial report found no signs of trauma. No clear cause of death could be established. The case was left classified as undetermined. For her family, this was not an answer. It was an open wound disguised as a conclusion. There were other troubling details. Some hair was still attached to the skull, but other strands were found separately, tangled around an earring she had reportedly not been wearing the night she disappeared. None of this was examined for foreign fibers, DNA, or other trace evidence. The clothing that was recovered was not tested for hairs or fibers from possible suspects. To the sheriff's department, there was nothing to suggest foul play, but to her family, and to many who learned about the case, the location, the condition of the remains, and the gaps in the investigation all pointed toward the possibility that something more sinister had happened. In July 2011, her body was exhumed for further examination. Forensic experts looked again, but the official stance did not change. Cause of death remained undetermined. There were no official signs of homicide. It was a conclusion that satisfied no one close to her. Her mother, Latisse, and her father, Michael, both filed lawsuits against the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, alleging negligence and mishandling of the case. They argued that Mitrice should never have been released into the night under the conditions she was, without her phone, without her wallet, without her car, and without any means of safe transportation. Eventually, the lawsuits were settled, and both parents received monetary compensation. But the sheriff's department never admitted wrongdoing. They never acknowledged that releasing her may have contributed to her death. In 2016, the California Attorney General's office announced it would conduct a criminal investigation into how the sheriff's department had handled the case, focusing on the possibility of destruction or concealment of evidence. After a year, the investigation concluded there was insufficient evidence to prosecute. By then, the statute of limitations for certain charges had already expired. For her family, that meant there would be no accountability, no official recognition of the mistakes they believed had been made, and no resolution to the questions that had haunted them from the beginning. Why was she released into the dark without a way home? How did she end up deep in that canyon? And what really happened in the hours between her last confirmed sighting and the day her remains were found? The official file on Mitrice Richardson's death may be closed, but the story is not. For her loved ones, it remains open every single day. After the remains were found in Dark Canyon and the official investigation concluded without a cause of death, the case shifted into a space that is perhaps the most painful for any family. The space where answers are replaced by theories. and where official closure feels more like a locked door than an open one. From the beginning, there were those who believed Matrice had simply wandered too far into the wilderness that night. They imagined her walking along the canyon roads in darkness, disoriented or exhausted, possibly slipping or falling into an area she could not escape. The rugged terrain of the Santa Monica Mountains could be unforgiving. Steep cliffs, loose rock, tangled brush. A wrong step, especially in the dead of night, could lead to injury or death far from any visible road. But that explanation never fully fit for her family. Dark Canyon was not just difficult to reach. It was remote in a way that didn't make sense for someone walking on foot from the Lost Hills Sheriff's Station. It required either an extraordinary amount of time and effort or help getting there. Then there was the strange condition of her remains, the separated leg, the unnatural position of her arm, the lack of animal disturbance despite being in the wild for nearly a year. To many, these details suggested that she had not simply collapsed where she was found. Her family held on to another possibility, that she had been met with foul play after leaving the station. The sheriff's department's decision to release her alone in the middle of the night without her phone, money, or car had placed her in a vulnerable position. If someone with ill intent had crossed her path, she would have had no immediate way to defend herself or call for help. Theories emerged about whether she had been picked up by a stranger or by someone she knew. Some wondered if her earlier interactions at her job, at the Playboy Mansion, at the restaurant that night, might have led to a connection that turned dangerous. There were even whispers about whether someone in law enforcement could have been involved, fueled by inconsistencies in statements and the sudden appearance of station surveillance footage that had supposedly not existed. Each theory came with its own web of possibilities, none of them leading to a clear truth, and each possibility weighed heavily on her parents. Latisse worked tirelessly to keep the case in public view, speaking to media outlets, attending community events, pressing for reforms to how law enforcement handles individuals in custody who may be in crisis. She pushed for what became known as Matrice's Law, legislation aimed at preventing police from releasing people under similar conditions in the middle of the night without means to get home and without ensuring their safety. Michael, her father, kept searching in his own way. He followed leads, no matter how unlikely, driving to Las Vegas when someone claimed to have seen her, or walking through Malibu canyons, hoping to find some overlooked clue. Each trip was a gamble between hope and heartbreak. The settlements from the lawsuits brought money, but no real peace. Money cannot answer the questions that haunt a parent's last memories of their child. Money cannot explain why the last hours of Matrice's life remain a mystery. In the years since her disappearance, her name has lived on in conversations about justice and accountability. She became a symbol, not just of a young woman lost too soon, but of the cracks in a system that can turn a minor arrest into an irreversible tragedy. And yet, when all the investigations ended, when the interviews were done, when the headlines faded, the central fact remained as raw as it had been on September 17th, 2009. A young woman walked out of the Lost Hills Sheriff's Station in the middle of the night. She vanished into the dark. 11 months later, she was found in a canyon no one could explain. And to this day, no one, not the sheriff's department, not the coroner, not the attorney general, has been able to say how she died or why she ended up there at all. For her family, the fight for answers continues in quiet ways. Not every battle happens in front of cameras. Some happen in the still moments at home, in the sifting through old photos, in the long drives past places where she might have been. Some happen in the way they speak her name out loud, so that even if justice never comes, her story will never be forgotten. Because for them, this was never just a case. This was Mitrice, and they will carry her and the unanswered questions surrounding her death for the rest of their lives. And so, the mystery of Mitrice Richardson comes to a quiet close here. Her story has been told, piece by piece, in the same order it unfolded, from the night of her arrest to her disappearance, to the unanswered questions that still remain. It is a story that weighs heavy because it ends without certainty. No verdict, no final truth. Only echoes, and a family still holding on to memory, love, and the hope that lessons were learned so others may not walk the same path. If you've listened this far, thank you for staying with me through every moment of this case. Stories like this are not easy, but they matter. They remind us of how fragile life is and how every choice, every oversight can change everything. Before you drift off tonight, I ask just one favor. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss the next story. Each case is told with care, with respect, and with the hope that these voices are not forgotten. Thank you for listening. Rest easy. Until the next story. Thank you.